Aaron Betsky fue comisario de la 11ª Bienal de Venecia en 2008. Actualmente es presidente de la Escuela de Arquitectura en Taliesin West. Crítico de Arte, Arquitectura y Diseño, Betsky es autor de más de una docena de libros, incluyendo un próximo estudio del modernismo en la arquitectura y el diseño. Formado como arquitecto y humanista en la Universidad de Yale, Betsky fue director del Museo de Arte de Cincinnati y del Instituto de Arquitectura de los Países Bajos, así como curador de Arquitectura y Diseño en el Museo de Arte Moderno de San Francisco. Démosle la bienvenida.
Good afternoon. I apologize not to speak Spanish to you, but I hope you all have your translators. I'm very happy you're all here. I also realize I will have to speak very fast because I have less time than I thought. I'm very happy to be here, but because I knew this was such a large auditorium and I was very scared, I brought all of my students from the School of Architecture at Taliesin. So there they are. If you want to know anything more about the school, they're all there, and they're all ready to answer all your questions. So, and they will protect me in case you start throwing things at me. So, what I want to talk to you about today, though, is something that is not really about buildings. Now, you might think that's strange because this is an architecture and urbanism conference, but I actually believe that we should be thinking beyond buildings. You know, I was listening to Oliati, who's an incredible architect and does absolutely beautiful buildings, but he was talking about all the effects that he wants to make, and he was using a lot of concrete, and he was making a very long corridor that takes you all the way around and uses a lot of concrete so you can be disoriented and find yourself in a bedroom. And I thought, is that really necessary? Do we really need to use so much building to have these very strong effects? I think maybe not. I think maybe there are other ways to do it. That maybe in a beautiful house that you build for yourself in Portugal, you can create these effects. But when you are in a more constrained situation, there are other things you can do. So I want to talk to you about architecture beyond building. And just to be clear, building is not architecture. Building in English means both a building, edificio, and it means to build. I am told that only in Spain do they say edificar, and that in Mexico you prefer construir. But the idea that there is an edificio, an edificar, that there is building, that's building. Architecture, arquitectura, is everything that is about building. It's how we understand building, how we talk about building, how we design, how we represent it to ourselves and to others. It is the meta of building. It is everything that transforms building into something that is beautiful, something that might be of social use, something that might be a catalyst for making the world around us better. So what I want to do is show you an array of responses to the specific problems and situations that architects face today. And of course, my clicker doesn't work. And of course, there we go. Come on. There we go. I think maybe I have to stand closer to this. So space is still a problem, even in the digital age. So the first thing you have to realize, all of you who are architects or want to be architects, you have to work very hard. Whereas when you go to Hollywood, you can make a world as you might imagine it. And you can get people to pay $1 billion to see it. And you can make an ideal world, a utopian world, a world in which thatched roofs on top of skyscrapers means that it is African, in which you can create a completely ideal, technologically fueled, but yet grounded environment. Or you can imagine that you can create a world, this is from the second Guardians of the Galaxy, where the whole world, just to give away the plot, is also a person, a brain, a mind, that all of reality is actually an architecture that is truly organic, that is truly everything at the same time. But this is what you have to do when you make buildings. This is the most important building of the last 5 years. Not because it's the best, but because it's meter by meter the most expensive and also the most, shall we say, influential. Because this, of course, is the headquarters for Apple, which runs half of our lives. This is the emblem of perfect building. This is utopia, the way architects can make it. This is a world in which, oh my goodness, my slides are getting stretched. Oh well. This is a world in which everything is perfect. This is the omega, the end point of architecture. And right in the middle, I have no doubt that Stephen Jobs is buried, so he can still oversee this endless Dilbert land of people wandering through these endless corridors when they don't run into the glass, and imagining how they're going to make our world completely Apple, completely dependent on nothing. Except, of course, they finish the building, and it's already too small. So this is the kind of crap that they build next to it. This is the kind of architecture that is not architecture, that is building, and that is a crime. People who make buildings like this should be locked up and should not be allowed to waste our resources building this kind of things. But this is the other interesting thing. I'm wondering, the technology people, the aspect ratio got changed. Is there any way you can make the correct aspect ratio? Everything has gotten stretched. No one understands me. You will have to imagine that this is not a Modigliani or Giacometti architecture. Everything should be like this. So my apologies. Everything is very, very tall. So this is the other aspect of Apple, which is this is an Apple store in Grand Central Station. Grand Central Station is the biggest railroad station in New York, in America. Most amount of travelers, very imposing building. And in the middle of it, Apple builds a store, because they build a store everywhere. Except there's no store there. You wander into this mezzanine, and somewhere you find these tables with the product lying on it, and your desire is awakened. You take out your other piece of technology, you hold it up to a scanner, someone scurries to the back and comes out with your new iPad or whatever the object of your desire is. There is no architecture. Only the architecture that was already there. There is no definition of building. So this is the reality that Apple is making. This virtual world in which we connect on Facebook and Twitter and Telegram and WhatsApp and Tinder and Grindr and all these other applications, and where we are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The physical part of this, the place that architects and urbanists have to address, is sprawl. Sprawl is a symptom of the complete dissolution of all forms. In this case, into this endless landscape. In Arizona, we say grade it and blade it. Grade it so it's flat, get rid of the nature, and plant grass on it. And you have these kind of boxes of absence that take over the desert. But not just in Arizona. The same thing happens in Japan. The same thing happens in China. The same thing happens even in Mexico City. That same sprawl that completely covers all of our reality. And within that sprawl, we live in our completely isolated cocoons, fed by technology, fed by air conditioning, by computers, by everything else that allows us to make our own little world and ignore everyone around us. We live in this reality that is absent, that is everywhere. Okay, does anyone know what this is? Oh, it's too old already. This is the video from Lord's Royals. This notion that we can be royals anywhere, whether it's New Zealand, where this was actually shot, or Los Angeles, where she lives now. All right, anyone know what this is? Yeah, what is it? Breaking Bad, all right. So this is the reality of everywhere, nowhere. This could actually be Monterrey, too. But what's interesting is if you Google, as I did when I was preparing a lecture, Breaking Bad, to get the images, you are actually given the site of a tour where they will take you to all these anonymous places that look all exactly the same, where all the same things happen, the same people live, and you can go see the sites where they shot Breaking Bad. It's completely absurd. Everything is everywhere. A meth lab could be a hairdresser, could be a school, could be a house. Everything is completely anonymous. There is no definition. There is no architecture. And what architecture there is, as Jürgen Meyer has pointed out, beige, a complete sameness of everything. The drinking of all color into this kind of brown shit color. The only thing that controls this world is security, is Big Brother watching us everywhere. Notice that it's always Big Brother, never Big Sister. In my case, it was Big Sister, but Big Brother watching you everywhere at the same time. Globally as well. You can't even be in the wilds of Afghanistan without the CIA watching you. So what's even worse, of course, is that all of this might just be an illusion. It probably is. We probably live in this world of zeros and ones that just projects a particular kind of reality. And we have become these pseudopods, these people who are all exactly the same, inhabiting this completely fake world. So what do you do? This is, ladies and gentlemen, your reality, my reality. This is where we live. This is where we have to work. You can flee from this by living in a nice old building, like almost all architects do, and creating really elaborate architecture if you have enough money. But this is our world. For the other 99% of us, this is how you have to live, how you have to work, how you have to play. This is what we are doing to our planet. These are the issues we have to address. So what do you do? Well, the easiest thing, of course, is to go with the flow. To say if everything is now completely sprawling into this world of digital knowledge, the continual movement of people and places and things, then we need an architecture that has the quality of being a gathering together of all of these forces. And we can even imagine that we now live in this giant hyper object, as the triple O people, the object-oriented ontology people, would have us believe, and that we must assemble an architecture out of the fragments of that triple O. But the reality, of course, is that this is what we actually make. When we actually get a commission, after all of our theories of blobism are worked out, it turns into a shopping mall and a fancy apartment building. It turns into high-rises, usually in other countries where they can afford it and where they need this kind of statement. And it completely overwhelms everything around it. This is a casino in Macau. So at the edges of that is where the interesting work happens. At the places where this notion of going with the flow, of making a fluid architecture that is part of the digisphere, becomes not just making object buildings that look fluid, but making things that actually dissolve, as Philippe Rum would propose, or imagining that objects and buildings can be grown, that we can have chimeras or hybrids that are somewhere between buildings and people and objects. Or you can imagine that you can create an architecture just out of projection, as the artist Doug Aitken did when he took over one of the ugliest monuments to ever be foisted upon the American people, the Hirshhorn Building in Washington, D.C., and covered it completely with a love song, which has this refrain, "I only have eyes for you," and he wanders through sprawl. He wanders through all of the United States and finds these voices singing of love and desire, singing alive this otherwise dead space. But of course, you can also, this is the touchiest clicker I've ever used, you also can imagine that you can use those same technologies to deform existing buildings. And you don't even need to build them, because with this kind of work, you are reimagining our reality. And that, to me, is the first step that we as architects need to take. Rather than trying to build some deferred utopia at some point in the future, somewhere out there, we need to actually reimagine the world as we already have and think about how we can remake it, rethink it, reimagine it, and redraw it, make it into architecture. We need to look at our reality and know that we can make it in another way. We need to, God damn, we need, why did no one else have problems with this? It must be an American thing. We gringos just don't have, we just don't feel it. What can I say? So here is how you can remake, reimagine reality, whether it's in the slums of Brazil or Mexico, or whether it's in the very heart of Paris, where you can extrapolate what is already there into something that is new. And here is here is a reimagination of it in the deepest heart of Africa, as they used to say, in Lagos, in Nigeria, imagining that infrastructure and buildings and landscape can grow together in this manner. And of course, it doesn't just have to be purely an idea. You can actually build it, as the artist Elm Green and Dragset did when they built this little fake Prada store, fully product accessorized, on a lonely road on the way out of Marfa. Or you can create an architecture like MVRDV that begins to dissolve the reality of the buildings all around it, literally brick by brick, bit by bit. And one of my favorite buildings, the buildings that really sums up this direction to me, is this wonderful project that Vinnie Maas of MVRDV did in his hometown. When he was 13 years old, he designed a new plaza for his little hometown. And the mayor found it and framed it and then called him once he became famous and said, "We want you to redesign our plaza. Come back to your hometown. The only problem is we need a shopping mall," right? Sprawl. You need a shopping mall everywhere. We went to the Diego Rivera house. What's next to that house now? A shopping mall. You need a shopping mall everywhere. And a shopping mall, by the way, that has no entrance on the street. Diego Rivera, those wonderful buildings that Guano Gorman did, and then a shopping mall. It's everywhere. So you have to build a shopping mall. So his reaction was to team up with one of the best photographers around and to photograph all of the buildings in this small town, over 200 of them, put them together in a computer, the Digisphere, and then meld them together into a structure that is all of those buildings summarized. Then blew it up 50% and printed it on glass, with the result that you have a building that is the essence of the architecture of this village, and at the same time, a building that is not there, an architecture that is merely a reimagination of everything that is this small town. So what you get when you think about architecture in this way is a little bit like what the artist Hiroshi Sugimoto does, which is to open his camera onto a screen like this, to let this movie go on for an hour and a half with all of its stories, all of its characters, all of its reality, the whole world summed up into something that when you leave the lens open becomes white, pure nothingness, that at the same time is everything. And when you get that pure everything, your eye starts wandering from the white to the edges, to all of the incredible ornament, to everything that is already there, that pre-exists. What you wind up with is architecture as a kind of ghost, a kind of memory of the acts of building and construction. What you wind up with is the denotation, the marking, the pointing, the heightening of our awareness of what is already there, what we otherwise don't notice. Architecture and urbanism become a way to rearrange the elements that define and constrain and constrict the world all around us. It becomes a way to figure out not how to create a functional solution which will wind up imprisoning us while using up a huge amount of natural resources, but how you can afford different possibilities. And one of my favorite examples of this is a small library designed by Snohetta in Toronto. Of course, libraries, maybe Medellin is different, but libraries these days are not places with books. There are no books in this building. They are information access points. And when Snohetta was working on libraries, they found out that people, maybe most of the students here, do their best work in public with everyone around. And they found that the most popular place to work was sitting with your laptop open with your back on the high-speed elevators so that you could see everything that was going on. So they designed an environment that would allow you to be part of this world, create your own social connections, whether it's directly in space or through the internet, through all your social apps, and have the possibility of letting architecture frame those activities, shape those activities, but afford you the possibility of using them in any number of different ways. And of course, the other big giant in Silicon Valley, other than Apple, which, by the way, whenever a company in Silicon Valley builds a monumental headquarters, sell their stock. It means they're over. So Apple's over. And here is what Facebook did, which is to walk into Frank Gehry's office and see the incredible mess that was in that office, which is the same now as when I worked there 30 years ago, and say, we want this, but we want 3 million square feet of this. We want this kind of messy vitality, to quote Robert Venturi. We want this kind of place where everything just happens, and the architecture works to shape different scales and social relations without defining, framing, imprisoning, or constricting us in any way. So what you wind up with is architecture as a skeleton that allows for parking garages and restaurants and apartments and stores all to be in this not neutral, but very strongly articulated form of architecture. It means that you reduce your palette, as arquitectes in Barcelona do, to the bare minimum to allow what already exists to become presence in all of its material beauty. And that, for me, is the second major lesson, which is we should not build anymore. I hate to tell all of you who want to be architects or are architects chasing your next job, stop. We should not be making any more buildings. If we can possibly avoid it, we should not use any natural resources that we cannot replenish. We should not use any more open space. We should not sprawl out into the suburbs or use up public space within our cities. We should reuse and rethink what we already have first and foremost. That doesn't mean just renovating it. It means honoring and finding the beauty within our existing structures. Finding a way, as David Ireland did in this house he did in San Francisco 30 years ago, to find the beauty, to even, if you will, fetishize the objects, the materials, the textures of the house, to burnish them, to make them gleam, to understand the beauty of what already was, the accident, the occurrences, the life that is embodied within our existing structures. Theaster Gates, an artist and architect trained as an urban designer and a potter and a philosopher, brought that all together when he did this fantastic project, the Dorchester Project in Chicago, making a house completely out of scrap material that he found on the site, and then filling it with the remnants of the library of Ebony magazine so that this African-American neighborhood could have a cultural center where they could rediscover their heritage as well as a physical memory of what this place was. In Detroit, The Heidelberg Project has now, for several decades, been assembling the cast-off toys, the leftover cloth, flags, memorials to people who died, and has been assembling them around buildings, creating a cultural space, a set of homes, a way to remember where you are. Or on a more refined note, you can take all of the leftover pieces of temples and hutongs that are being torn down and turn them into a new kind of structure without having to build anything new. And obviously, the most banal or straightforward version of this is that we should reuse materials. And in the United States, they now predict that within 10 to 15 years, 60% of all the work that architects will do will be renovations or restorations. And I believe it's probably already much higher in Mexico. It's certainly much higher in Europe. This is going to be the real work of architects, and we need to figure out how to find the meaning and the beauty in reusing existing materials, in finding old factories in Shenzhen and turning them into lively art centers, revealing but also occluding, hiding parts of the existing structure so that they can have a new life. It's happening at the scale of factories in the Ruhr Valley, as well as in places like Detroit, where the old mine buildings and the old iron smelters are turning into swimming pools and museums and concert halls and beer gardens and climbing walls and just about any kind of other use that you can possibly imagine. In Spain, you can take an old factory and turn it into a headquarters for Red Bull's Music Academy, again made out of completely reused materials. You can imagine extending the structures of a city like Paris and using leftover fragments of buildings to create additions rather than just pouring more concrete. Take the scaffolding that we use to make buildings and turn that scaffolding itself into our architecture. The firm 212 Architects in the Netherlands has created what they call a resource map, in which that you can plot in all the different materials around you so that you can use leftover sinks or even washing machines and turn them into houses and cafes. You can take the leftovers of cars. You can take tire tracks and turn all of those into a cafe. At the Biennale 2 times ago, Aravena made a kind of statement in the first room to the whole Biennale by taking what was left over from the last Biennale, the Art Biennale, and repurposing it into something that represented what was wasted, what was present that we had forgotten about, turning that into the very point of the architecture. Artists, like always, are far ahead of architects, finding ways to take what seemed to be nothing but scrap and turning them into an architecture, into a sculpture, into art, finding within them the beauty of the ugly, the beauty of the leftover, the beauty of what you see on the streets here. You know, when I started taking fancy rich people to Mexico City and taking them to some of the public spaces I loved, like the plazas of UNAM or some of the spaces right around here, they kept noticing the dirt, the grime, and the ugliness. And I kept saying, no, look what Barragan did here with this layout. But of course, it is also the dirt. It is the life that is lived within these spaces that we have to condense into architecture, that we have to make into form. This is a fabulous Mexican architect exhibiting in Los Angeles, taking the leftovers of a home that was torn down and destroyed to remind him and us of a family that was displaced, of the beauty of a life that was lived, that might not seem to answer to our highest aesthetic standards, but that contains the life all around us. Architects everywhere are exploding and exposing what exists as building in order that we might see and understand, then reuse what already is and might find a way to give it new life. Frank Gehry started this many decades ago when he made his own house by taking an existing building, opening it up, revealing how it was made, what was hidden within the walls, and then replicating that, extending that, using the materials of the street, turning the asphalt of the driveway into the floor of the kitchen, reusing the old windows as cabinets, putting on chain link fence and corrugated metal to make a new architecture. And as I said, well, let's just keep going. And you can do that not just with physical form, but also, as Perry Culper has been doing since about the same time, by using digital and handcrafted materials, by assembling what is left over, the materials from a 5 and dime store, from a very cheap store, to create an artwork that reminds us of the beauty, to create a whole world that is filled with toy cars and racing trains and building blocks, all of the elements from which we as little kids all made the architecture that we now want to impose on the whole world. A kind of memory of a utopia of an innocent childhood that also proposes a city that consists of all of these already pre-made things. Sterling Ruby creating art out of all those things that we exactly think are fake, are ugly, are not what we should be appreciating, and assembling them, gathering them together. Because, and then my favorite project of all, is there anyone from SciArc here? I think there's people from SciArc here. You might remember this project. This was a thesis project several years ago, or a year ago, that no one could understand, and I don't understand, the chicken project. But somehow to me this seems like architecture. This seems like how you understand this fullness of our consumer society, the associations we have with all these strange animals and beings all around us, and imagines that we can create a house that is a proposal for the student's grandmother in a small town in China, but transformed into a glittery memory of the true beauty of the chicken, from chicken bacon all the way to completely gilt chicken feet. Here you can see the chicken bacon. Aaron Bessler finding the beauty within the walls, within the ducts that we otherwise ignore, or the possibility that we can again take all kinds of cast-off materials and animate them with our very breath, with our sweat, with our movement through a room, and with that piezoelectric energy, reuse that in order to create a completely animate society. Probably at the far edges of this is this proposal by François Roche to make a glass building in Thailand that would be electrically charged, so it would bring all of the dust, all of the pollution of Bangkok and create a hoary form all around it. But architecture can be now as simple as taking the leftover stones from a park in Germany, the leftover sculptures, and piling them up to create a place of art, create a place where an artist, an architect, or a philosopher can gather a group of people to speak. It can mean only animating a leftover railroad line in the middle of Sicily by piling up a few rocks, putting a staircase over it so you can look at the environment all around you. And again, this is not just avant-garde work. This is also at the very mainstream what public space is becoming in the Western world. This, of course, is the High Line, which is the single most successful piece of architecture built in the last 20 years, purely from a financial standpoint, if not from a social or aesthetic standpoint, having created by now well over $15 billion worth of worth just by taking an old railroad line and turning it into a park, a place for people to gather, an idea that is now being copied in Chicago and Seoul and all over the world. Big business, of course, is way ahead of the architects, taking unused docklands and parking lots and turning them into temporary sites for Nike and Adidas and all these kinds of companies. But there also are refined firms such as Assemblage in London, creating this absolutely simple little courtyard. And I have to tell you one little story in my 12 minutes I still have left of young Belgian architects several years ago who got their first commission. And their first commission was to design a small public square just like this in Belgium. And they were very earnest, like I'm sure all of you would be. They went to this site and they researched everything there, the wind directions, how much rain there was, what kind of materials were present, where the bus lines were, where the stoplights were, how people used it. They did interviews with all the people there, and they made this big report, and at the end of the report they said, do nothing. Leave it absolutely the way it is. Architecture, in terms of making something, is not the solution. The solution is to make people aware of what already is there. And here's our bill for 15,000 euros. So you can make architecture, you can make money in architecture by doing nothing. Or even here, I was very inspired, for those of you that were here on Saturday, in seeing the presentation of where InfoNav has been going in the last few years, concentrating on renovation and restoration, and these kind of wonderful public spaces that they are making all throughout Mexico. This is, for me, the very emblem of this kind of architecture. Many of you probably know the great public squares that were done in Barcelona right before, during, and then after the Olympics they had there in 1988, when they used that as an excuse to create some of the grandest new public spaces that, again, have been copied all around the world. And they've kept that program going for years, but this is the newest of them. This is a project that's not in the fancy area where all the tourists come. This is an area in a working-class neighborhood that just happens to have a hill overlooking the whole city that had been used as a gun emplacement in the Second World War and had then been covered with illegal houses. And all these people made proposals for planting trees and making a belvedere and doing all these kind of fancy things. And these architects said, don't do any of that. Just tear down enough of the houses so that you can have a view and make enough steps and ramps so that everyone can use it, and leave it there with a memory of everything that went into that place, from war to occupation to crime, and have all of that be present, assemble that, bring that together into this public space. So architecture should be not about making more new buildings that cost money and resources, constrict us, constrain us, tell us what to do, and by the way, have to be renovated even before they're done because uses change continually. But rather, it should be about opening. It should be about unbuilding, about opening up our existing structures. It should be about revealing, as Rem Koolhaas did at his Biennale, what is hidden within our walls, what we don't see. It should be about scraping away at the bland surfaces of absence and finding not the zeros and ones of the matrix, I hope, but rather what we as architects and designers do to construct things and to turn that into architecture, not to cover it up, but to turn that into the objects, into the forms, into the spaces that animate and catalyze our daily lives, that make us aware of and let us use and reuse and rethink the objects and images and spaces of everyday life. Well, I already showed Besler. I knew there was something out of whack. So architecture to me, in the end, is about reuse, reimagination, gathering together. It's about affording possibilities. It's about seeing and reimagining our world in a different way. It is the one thing that changes whatever is around it. It is a way of holding up your finger, I hope not this finger, but this finger, so that you can see the world around you in a different way, even if that means blurring the reality all around you, even if it means reminding us of what it means to be at home, as Robert Rauschenberg did when he took the bed that Jasper Johns and he shared and turned it into a work of art hanging in the Museum of Modern Art. Or as Frank Gehry did when he turned his childhood memories of playing with a fish in a bathtub before it was turned into a meal and made that into an object that is a light, that for him is also an emblem of perfection, perfection that is not the circle of the Apple headquarters, but is this continually changing, amorphous thing and is also just a smelly fish. When I went back to that Dorchester project that I showed you a few images before, it was occupied by a crazy a French architect called Xavier Vrona, who had turned it into a headquarters for a new revolution, a place where we could imagine that revolution would start. And I think that, where revolution would start. And I think that is what architecture can do. It can take the kind of division between the privileged sprawl of these big, wasteful, horribly ugly American homes and all that they exclude in beauty and in people, and repropose different ways, new ways of seeing and using and rethinking it. We can propose that instead of isolating ourselves at a domestic level, or as my country is trying to do, at a national level, unless we get rid of the criminal who's now in the White House soon enough, and instead can figure out how we can activate our differences, how we can create a beauty, a continual construction. You know, we in America, we learn from everything that goes around us, and we find the possibility of making architecture not as a finished object, but rather as a catalyst for continual change and continual construction. Again, I was very inspired by the kind of small additions that Invinov is now doing here in Mexico City as well. We can imagine architecture as a temporary establishment. One of the richest men in America, who owns the shoe company Zappo, lives in a trailer in Las Vegas that they assemble together to create a community around them outside of the big casinos that surround them. And we can imagine that we can take, and this is the work of one of our students, raise your hand if you're here, I think you're here somewhere, reimagining even the worst parts of our reality as a new and more hopeful place. I've been working on a book with the people from Urban Think Tank who started by making great infrastructure projects and civic projects, but who then looked at the kind of self-organizing society that is all around us and that is especially lively in South and Central America, and saw their work as not replacing it, not making something better, not pretending that architecture has a solution, not making more objects, more housing projects, but rather going with a photographer, Iwan Ban, and looking at what people were doing, looking at what people were doing, trying to understand the social relations that were being created and turning that into the possibility of a new architecture. So this is the architecture that interests me, where we don't look up at the latest, tallest, shiniest buildings with the most complicated sections and floor plans, but rather that we place ourselves on top of buildings, looking down as these crazy Russian kids do, and trying to see the vertiginous possibilities that stretch up not in the future and not above us, but down there and all around us. This is what I tried to do in the Shenzhen Biennale a few years ago, when I encouraged architects to assemble all kinds of leftover materials to make a new kind of architecture. And this is also, and this was probably the best project of all of them, where you create an architecture out of what is left over, what is left behind, what is seen as dirt, and turn that into a new architecture. So this is what we're trying to do as well as we sit at Taliesin and Taliesin West, what used to be the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, where we occupy in this horrible place of sprawl and in the beautiful desert this great campus designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which might look like a monument to some of you, but which actually, and here is where we spend the other half of the year in Spring Green, Wisconsin. We migrate between these two places, and we sit in these wonderful rooms where we learn from Frank Lloyd Wright and figure out how to turn that into a future architecture. But what's important to me is that Taliesin West especially, but also Taliesin, started as an encampment, as a way to be in the landscape rather than building on it, a way to create what to me is the essence of architecture, which is the weaving together of everything that is around you, from the spaces to the materials around you, into a shelter, a place of temporal sociality, a place where you can see and understand and inhabit the world all around you. Those were the principles on which Taliesin was built. Those are the principles that we still study while we are at Taliesin, and those are the principles that we figure out as each of the students, as their thesis project, has to look at the desert, look at how we can be at home in our modern world, and translate that into a shelter where they live, that they build themselves, and that then becomes the model for how we might make an architecture that reveals and makes habitable the world all around us. It's an act quite often of restoration with great love, as our student Lorraine Etchell did with this great structure, Japanese house that she and her boyfriend just renovated. But it is, above all else, an act of continual construction, of continually figuring out how you can make a new world. I love this image with our student, Carl, who just graduating, sitting here getting a desk kit from Todd Williams and Billy Tsin in this shelter that he designed. And here's the latest of the shelters designed by Chilean architect Jaime Inostrozo, the Atalaya, the crow's nest, from which he can see the world all around you. So that's what we're trying to do at Taliesin. That's what I hope that we have to offer to the world all around us, learning from the great traditions, the knowledge of architecture, using the skills that come out of knowing the incredible history that is now embedded within us, as Oljati showed us at the beginning of his lecture, using that knowledge not just to serve clients, not just to pretend that we have solutions, but to actually figure out how we can make the world all around us more open, more sustainable, and more beautiful. So come join us at Taliesin. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.